sounds like what you're talking about is very much reflecting what you've talked about when you talk about your education and the character building and the multiple things that you need. You almost saying for the kind of visionary kind of intellectual work that of the greats that you mentioned, you need to be almost a very strong person able to go into the wilderness and do your thing no matter what, and take the knocks and be strong enough to actually keep going, which is not what a bureaucrat is. Bureaucratic training is different.
It's very much like that. I mean, even the metaphor of going into the wilderness is obviously a biblical metaphor, because the Old Testament prophets and others who led their people away from subjection, they had to cross the Red Sea, or they go out into the wilderness and set up a new civilization. So there's an element of visionary prophecy. You have to believe, and that applies and has applied in my life, writing and fields of interest. But it also applies, as I talked about before, in my work in technologies and so on. Because what you have to do is basically, on the basis of what you've observed about your own life and about history in the past, guess where the future is going to be. You have to know from experience and from self-confidence that there is an oasis over there, or that you are sailing between islands in the Pacific and there, Captain Cook, there should be land over there. It's a hunch, it's a guess, it's dangerous, it's tricky. But as with all intellectual creativity, the greater the risk, if it turns out right, the greater the reward. If you do small incremental things in your oasis, it's not going to get you anywhere. If you do crazy, as Einstein said, unless it's absurd, there's no chance for it. Unless you do something completely absurd and try and understand and write a book about Japan or whatever it is, if it fails, it'll be dismal. If it succeeds, it could change the world. And when I looked back over my life and as I was working, I thought, well, what is the point of someone, in the end, you have a small obituary somewhere which said, Alan Macfarlane is well known for his book on witchcraft in Tudor and Stuart Essex, which was an important influence in the 1960s and 70s on work. That's it, full stop. I mean, why not try? And as you said, it's not only a matter of character and sort of Robinson Crusoe individualism. It's also about friendship and support, because doing this kind of work is very lonely. And if you don't have other people around you who say, Alan, what you're doing is crazy, but important, and do it, and we believe in you. Now, that was the other part of my life, which was terribly important, learning companionship and friendship at schools. So we would run up mountains or go fishing or do anything together, and there was mutual support between us. And I had the wonderful support of my mother and Sarah that I've talked about before, and Jerry Martin, who I've talked about, sort of group of people who believe in you and who give you the confidence and support at the early phases. And Ernest and Jack and Marilyn Strathern and my heads of department and others in Cambridge. And this was also a very strong feature of Cambridge University. People, and Oxford, people don't sort of say, when do you write your last article for a peer-reviewed journal? They take you as your whole person and find out what you're doing at the moment, and they don't immediately worry about the immediate consequences. So you are encouraged to think much more widely and to have self-confidence and to move and to look around at examples in Cambridge and elsewhere of people like I mentioned before, John Maynard Keynes and others, who didn't feel that there was a boundary to economics. They could go into other fields. So the polymath, the person, or at least the person who is interested in everything, not necessarily particularly good at it, but interested in a wide field, And the final point about that is that by wandering around from oasis to oasis, as I think I've mentioned before, that often solves problems which you had in your first oasis, because you, as I mentioned with tea, you find a clue to the importance of tea in 18th century Britain in a 13th century tract in Japan. And it's perhaps related to a remark that I really like from Einstein. He said that problems, and I may have quoted it, problems are never solved at the level at which they are formed. In other words, if you have a problem about American civilization and what's wrong with America now, you'll never solve it by looking at America or even thinking in terms of America. You have to go up one level. And that's the reason for looking at civilizations, because the problems that we have in Britain with Brexit and Europe and so on, bits and pieces can be tinkered around here, but you need to go up one level, look at world history and civilizational history, and then you will see solutions which people won't think about because you're too much at the level of the problem. You have to go up one. And going from distributing yourself, in a way, it's like the early work which won the Nobel Prize for pulsars, which I interviewed Anthony Hewish, who was one of the Nobel Prize winners. And the things which looked and detected the pulsar stars were a whole lot. They were spread along a railway line, as I saw them later, of radio telescopes. And you got a huge telescope because they were positioned along the radio. If you just had one, you would have only got one reading. If you work on a number of different subjects in different civilizations and different times, you've got a whole lot of things pointing, and you can see things which you wouldn't be able to do from one dimension.